Welcome, everyone. We're going to take a couple moments to let everyone in. So please feel free to grab your lunch, get a hot beverage, get settled in, just get comfortable.
Yeah, I'm just going to shut this door here.
Anyways.
If you can make sure it's not too loud, Holly. Well, I'm just going to shut the door.
Welcome, everyone. We're just taking a few minutes here to let everyone get settled in as people start to arrive. So take a moment, get comfortable. While we wait for everyone to come, I will just do maybe a brief introduction to who I am. I am a new face at Knowledge Hub, K-Hub. I'm a graduate research assistant, and I'll be guiding us through today's Lunch and Learn session. I also just want to put a disclaimer that there is a recording in progress right now, and that will be going on for the entirety of today's workshop. So please do keep that in mind as you toggle on or off your camera. And we'll just give another minute or two for people to start to arrive here. And in case you just joined us, we are just taking a moment here to welcome everyone in. So feel free to grab your lunch, get a hot coffee or tea or beverage, get comfortable before I get started with some housekeeping items. And welcome. Thanks for coming. Okay, great. Just to respect everyone's time, I think we will start just some housekeeping items. So today our topic is bringing advocacy back in, the importance of restoring the advocacy mandate of immigrant settlement agencies. We have John here who will be giving us a wonderful presentation in just a few moments. And I just want to say thank you for being here today. I know November in particular can get a bit busy, so thank you for carving some time out today, being part of this community so we can learn and share together. And with that, I wanted to do land acknowledgement. So I myself is tuning in from the unceded and traditional territory of the Six Nations of the Grand River, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I invite you to join the chat, write in where you're tuning in from today. If you have a land acknowledgement of your own that you'd like to do, it is more than welcome here. Just a quick land acknowledgement on behalf of K-Hub Immigrant Service Calgary head office is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tusitina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. Awesome. Just some housekeeping items. So if you're new to Microsoft Teams or this is one of your first Lunch and Learns, welcome. We do ask to please mute yourself when you are not speaking, just to reduce our background noises. And you can do that by clicking that microphone button. And when you see kind of a diagonal line go in between it, that's how you know that your microphone is muted. If you have any questions, please do put it in the chat. I know our presenter, John, has voted time at the end of the discussion for questions. So you're more than welcome to put the questions in the chat, and then certainly we will come back to them. And during the Q&A period, there also is the raise the hand function, which you're more than welcome to use there. Okay, another disclaimer, you might have heard me talk about this before, but our session right now is being recorded. We also have a few photos that will be taken for our social media posts that will be uploaded on LinkedIn and Instagram. So feel free to turn your camera off if you're not comfortable with that. Or maybe if you're eating your lunch and you want to do so in peace, that's totally fine too. We respect your decision. We do love to see faces if you're comfortable, but the decision is absolutely yours. Okay, and just quickly, so if you'd like to invite your friends or colleagues or maybe connections in another organization to our Lunch and Learns, this is the QR code here. So this registration page is updated regularly. You can sign up for future sessions using the same QR code here. For our upcoming Lunch and Learns, this is actually the last Lunch and Learn of our year together, which is quite special. We'll be taking a pause in December, just in the spirit of rest and holidays. But for January, we will be having Julie and Susanna, which are those two faces you see up there, talking about co-designing for anti-racism and equity in settlement. So the last thing before we hear from John here is just our poll. So 70% of us would like a bit of a refresher on Gateway and K-Hub. I can do a quick overview of those initiatives for us. So just give me one moment to launch the poll here. Okay, so would you like a refresher on Gateway and K-Hub? I hope that poll went out okay. Yes, I'm seeing the responses come in now, so I'll just give a minute. And just another little tidbit about our 2025 Lunch and Learns. We have some really great topics. We'll be releasing our 2025 presenter schedule soon. A lot of the topics incorporate things that requests we got from our attendees. So it should be a great year for Lunch and Learns. Okay, so I'm seeing here that we might need a bit of a refresher, 73%. That's great. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay, wonderful. So first I'll just go over the Gateway platform. So we can go ahead and follow along this diagram here. But the Gateway platform was conceived to emulate a client-centric approach to supporting newcomers' goals. So this is a newcomer family. When they arrive, they're looking for guidance, information, support on their journey, in their settlement journey. Next, they get connected with a gateway planner, and a gateway planner gathers information to create a very personalized plan for the family. This plan is guided by the evidence-based social determinants of health model. The gateway planner presents the personalized plan to the client and obtains their consent to share their information with agreed upon services and organizations that best meet their client's needs. Gateway planners can refer clients to programs and services offered by Gateway partners, primary support services, also organizations that are not Gateway partners as well. Referrals can be made to an employment service, family focus service, or the food bank, just to give a couple examples. But this whole process here is actually managed through a database called the Partner Portal. So this means that the entire process can be tracked, and then also the outcomes of the client's progress can be followed in terms of what their outcomes were with the agency referrals and if they had success in those areas and so on. Of course, it's noteworthy to mention that maintaining clients' confidentiality and privacy is Gateway's utmost importance as well. Okay, and so we're switching over to kind of the newcomer knowledge hub. We also call this K hub, which you'll hear it commonly referred to. But essentially, our goal is to create a system for aggregated and de-identified newcomer data. So our intention is to use this data to create information and knowledge that holds values for people like yourselves, researchers, educators, policymakers, service users, service practitioners, funders, donors. It's a long list, but it's to essentially inform the larger Southern Alberta settlement sector and understand how we can continue to improve our ability to better serve newcomers. So one last thing before I pass it over to you, John. So I just want to do a little bit of a reminder that today there is also a book raffle. So we will be doing a raffle after the Q&A period at the end of John's presentation. This book pays particular attention to the provision of social, human, and health services in Canada's changing welfare state system. And I will be putting the link in the chat just right after this. But I will pass it over to John. So John Shields is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And just give me one moment so I can share your slides here.
Yeah, great.
Okay, lovely. Can you see that okay?
Looks good.
Awesome. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank everybody for attending the session today. It's great to be able to have a chat with a whole a variety of people that I would normally get to have a chat with. Also, I did want to thank Lindsay, Jeff, and Jessica for getting this all organized and making this possible. So that's fantastic. Next slide, please. So what I would like to do today is in this talk is to focus, of course, on advocacy in the nonprofit sector. However, I want to put this discussion in a broader context in terms of the roles in particular of community-based nonprofit service providing organizations. And these organizations like immigrant serving agencies and other nonprofit organizations in the settlement sector, and how they in fact have their advocacy has been shaped under the impact of decades of neoliberal restructuring and neoliberal public policy. I did. I couldn't resist putting a photo of the book up there because it's recently released, and it does cover a lot of these topic areas plus others. So I have used some of this in terms of trying to develop this talk. Next slide, please. Now, as part of this, I'm going to speak about the dichotomy in the nonprofit sector between resilience and precarity, because that actually shapes nonprofit advocacy in a whole variety of ways. And I'll come back and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And I also want to look at the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, which opened up an opportunity, in fact, to build back better with a possibility to reset relationships between nonprofit providers and funders based on a more collaborative and cooperative approach over hyper-competitive orientations that have dominated in the past. Although the moment here, unfortunately, may be closing. This opened up a policy window, and a lot of cooperation happened during that period of time. But I think we may be going back to the past practices with respect to this. And I'm going to conclude with some reflections what the current situation appears to be and why enhanced nonprofit advocacy remains so important going into the future. Next slide, please. Now, I think it's important to start with a little bit of background about the roles of nonprofit organizations and also about the rise of neoliberalism. And generally speaking, nonprofits are said to play two key roles within society. One is to provide services to the community, services that in part are very tangible, like food, shelter, clothing, training, health services, and others that may be a little bit more intangible, like counseling, emotional supports. In other words, to do good works within society. And often, of course, these services are offered in partnership with government, with the sector, the nonprofit sector, nonprofit service providers providing the services, but often funded in whole or in part by government funders. And in fact, in the settlement sector, it's very common that 85% of the funding comes from government sources. A second role, of course, is that of advocacy. And in its very broadest sense, advocacy ranges from public education around issues or societal problems to direct advocacy or direct lobbying of government to promote policies and programs to the benefit of clients and for the public good. I'm going to come back and I'll say a lot more about advocacy and those kind of different dimensions of it a little bit later. But it's actually through the advocacy role of nonprofits that it contributes to a public policy dialogue within the country. Next slide, please. And advocacy. So advocacy has a very positive societal benefit. Nonprofit advocacy, that role serves to broaden the democratic experience within society. It facilitates for the most vulnerable and the marginalized within society, and within the political process as well. In fact, the advocacy role has often been viewed as a counterweight to powerful vested economic and political interests in society. So it serves, a really useful democratic function here. Also, active nonprofit advocacy contributes to greater societal inclusion and societal cohesion. Nonprofits are often mediators within society, so they can help to connect people into the social networks, create, as I said, inclusion and greater inclusion and societal cohesion. Furthermore, nonprofits, through their voice role and the engagement they offer to those in the community, contribute very importantly to building citizenship, which of course is really important in terms of immigrant service to newcomers to Canada. And in its essence, citizenship, we have to remember, is about participation and membership within a community. Next slide, please. Citizenship, in fact, extends far beyond the important but simple act of voting every 4 years. It's about a deeper participation and involvement within our communities. And nonprofits really open up the avenues for this deeper form of engagement. Nonprofit organizations provide a very unique way of social organizing based on values of independence, based upon values like altruism, and based upon the community through collective forms of action. And community-based nonprofits are as much about participation as they are about provision, about the services. They're much about citizenship, therefore, as they are about service. Next slide, please. Nonprofit organizations are part of civil society. In fact, they're often referred to as the organizational face of civil society. And civil society is that space, if you will, between the state, the market, and the family. It's that, space in between, if you will. It's a space where democracy is able to establish its roots and to flourish. So it's really absolutely necessary for democracy to be created and to survive within society. And so civil society really acts as a reservoir of caring, of cultural life, of intellectual innovation, schooling people in the skills of citizenship and cooperation. It's where community is established and where community is nurtured. And clearly the role that settlement organizations play with newcomer populations with respect to voice and citizenship is critically important. They're building our communities from the ground up. Next slide, please. Now, let me say a few words about neoliberalism. Because it is a concept that's used a lot, but getting a handle on what it is can be a little bit, I guess, tricky for people. But let me just try to explain it this way. First of all, neoliberalism became a force in Canada and elsewhere, really coming out of the 1970s and in particular the 1980s, emerging out of an economic crisis that had existed back in the mid 1970s. And really it's centered around an approach that seeks to, if you will, shrink the state, especially the social programs within that the state offers through austerity programs, and to promote market solutions to basically all or most every problem within society. It very much prioritizes the idea of individualism and responsibilization approaches to policy, shifting risk onto individuals, families, and communities, shifting the responsibility away from the state, in other words, and onto these other individuals, families, communities within society. Now, one of the ways it does this in terms of the nonprofit sector has been through the use of new public management, or what is in short called MPM. And it really has been used to try to marketize nonprofit work as part of the promotion of an alternative service delivery type of system. So government's no longer doing those service delivery. It's now, in a relationship with a contract relationship with the state. It's doing those types of services. It's about imposing business practices, standard, private sector business practices into the nonprofit sector. And, new public management in that way has really been sort of a transition belt for structuring neoliberal ideas and values into the sector. It's about, economizing all of the facets of society and their interactions through this kind of, the genius of the so-called market mechanisms and those types of values and approaches, which, um, runs against a lot of the values that are actually embodied within the nonprofit sector. Next slide, please. When we look at the Canadian settlement services system and the Canadian model of settlement services, it of course relies upon nonprofit organizations to deliver government-funded integration services. And so in the case of Canada, it wasn't that those services were once done by government. They were always kind of done through the nonprofit sector, but under a little bit of a different type of funding kind of regime that was much more relaxed and much more, I would say, community type of centered. But after the 1980s, that relationship changed and was really kind of dominated by new public management approaches, which is these, private business types of orientations. And of course, that model of settlement services, funding of settlement services, has been guided then by new public management. And under that system, and there's a lot more that could be said about it, but let me just say these few things here, is that the state funds projects and not organizations. And that means that they actually underfund organizations. All of the things that are used to support organizations in terms of their rent and so forth are not really fully compensated in the funding packages that are given for programs. So the programs are funded. We can argue whether those programs are adequately funded or not, but certainly a lot of the overhead costs are not adequately compensated for in this new public management model. The state also, of course, sets accountability and reporting rules, and they set very strict targets and eligibility criteria, which of course have various kinds of limits. So who is eligible for the services so that part-time immigrants, temporary immigrants are usually excluded from that. And it can have adverse impacts on the capacities and the autonomy, and of course, the advocacy of nonprofit organizations. Now, I should say that IRCC has reformed its new public management model over the years in some positive ways. So they have made some adjustments. One of those was moving away from 1-year funding to 5-year funding so that organizations are better positioned to be able to plan into the future. And there's been, a few other sort of alterations, but basically that new public management model has very much been the sort of standard model that's used to structure those kinds of funding types of relationships. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk a little bit about nonprofit service providers in neoliberal times through the prism, if you will, of nonprofit precarity and resilience. Because if we look at the nonprofit sector, the community nonprofit sector, it really does have sort of a Janus face. It has kind of two faces to it. And the value of exploring that dichotomy, that the sector is both precarious and resilient, I think is quite revealing. Now, neoliberalism continues to shape both the sector's precariousness as well as the direction of its resilience. And what is precarity? Well, precarity is really about insecurity, it's about uncertainty, it's about instability, and it's about enhanced risks. So precarity covers all of those kinds of elements. And the aspects of nonprofit precarity, I think, can be captured under three categories, if you will. One is the populations that are serviced by nonprofits tend to be precarious populations. These are people who are at higher risk, or they have a lot of vulnerabilities. Secondly, its own workforce is also precarious, and that's because it's dependent upon funding, inadequate funding, so that the compensation to the nonprofit ISAs are often not really adequate to give uh, the same level of salaries and wages, and of course benefits. And then also they're always dependent on the next funding cycle. So there's a lot of, even if you're full time, if that fund doesn't come through, then your job security is very much on the line. And third, nonprofit organizations are also precarious because they're always trying to search for the extra dollars that are needed to support the organization's operations and structures, because the program funding doesn't do a good enough job in order to support that. Next slide, please. So neoliberalism's role in fostering nonprofit precarity is in the nonprofit sector is largely, as I said, through new public management. And it's kind of a constructed form of precarity. It normalizes the imposition of constant restructuring and austerity. And during crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, precariousness is magnified, and of course, resilient responses were called for. So, what is resilience then? So resilience, or at least the standard definition of it, is I would say it's also a limited definition of resilience. It's about the ability to withstand, to adapt, and recover from a crisis. The nonprofit sector has long been seen as a resilient sector, as being able to deal with a lot of difficulties, and they had a lot of agility and so forth. The other thing we should know is that resilience doesn't come in just one form. There's a number of sort of forms of resilience. And the dominant form, of course, that we've mostly seen is what I'll call here neoliberal resilience. And perhaps the way of best describing neoliberal resilience is in a phrase, to resiliently endure. So it's really put upon individuals and families and organizations to manage that sort of difficulty, right? And for the nonprofit sector, it is really largely through this idea of doing more with less. And I'm sure you've all heard that phrase before. And the ability to operate under continuous stress. Neoliberal resilience is very individually centered. It's closely connected to, as I said before, responsibilization approaches to policy and the downloading of risk onto individuals, families, and communities. It's associated with neoliberalism's hyper-competitiveness and individualized model of market-centered public policy. Individuals and communities are held responsible for their own well-being. And resilience also becomes depoliticized because it's really focused on maintaining the status quo and also not challenging that status quo. And neoliberalism rejects nonprofit advocacy because first of all, it says that nonprofit organizations should really be about service, not advocacy primarily. And it also sees advocacy as a special interest activity, and therefore to be suspicious and certainly not something to be funded, certainly not by government. Next slide, please. Now, neoliberal restructuring has forced a state of, if you will, everyday resilience onto the nonprofit sector, compelling nonprofits to manage through their precarity, a situation leaving the sector to stretch its resources, to intensify work, to adapt, to innovate for survival, and continuously struggle. Our immigrant settlement agencies in this process are often cast as passive, one-dimensional service providers. And nonprofits are not able in that kind of system to invest in the future in terms of their longer term sustainability, and their overall capacity is eroded in the everyday struggle to survive. So in these ways, it really does work against long-term sustainable and long-term notions of resilience. However, there's a different type of idea of resilience, and that's a progressive notion of resilience, which is sometimes referred to as transformative resilience or social resilience. And that is not just about bouncing back, but it's about bounding forward. It's about building back better, if you will, a term we heard during the pandemic, with a social justice kind of orientation. And a project that I've been part of for quite a number of years, called Building Migrant Resilience in Cities, we really were sort of looking at this concept and looking at uh, the role that organizations like nonprofit organizations and other organizations and migrants themselves have played in building a more progressive notion of resilience. And there's a web link there if you're interested in looking at some of the reports from that project. Next slide, please. So resilience is not about everyday survival, but it should be about struggle and resistance and progressive reinvention. Social resilience moves beyond an individualized orientation, focusing on relational dynamics, including the key role that institutions, and I would say most importantly, nonprofit institutions, but they're not the only ones, government's also important in this, play in shaping social inclusion within society.
เฉลย
Uh,
กับ
pardon? No. This approach emphasizes active and the dynamic over the passive, the importance of challenging power relations and structures of inequality, and the transformative capacities and potentialities of individuals, of groups, of communities, and of social institutions like nonprofits are very much brought to the fore in this type of orientation. Next slide, please. Hence, the dichotomy and the dynamics of precariousness and resilience of the nonprofit sector in an era of neoliberalism is really quite revealing. Neoliberalism presses to maintain the community nonprofit sector in a state of constructed precariousness as a thinly resourced protective social layer for the highly vulnerable, like immigrant communities, promoting offloading and such downloading of responsibilities. And in that sort of situation, social deficits magnify. The nonprofit national organization Imagine Canada, actually back in 2018, noted that the social deficits in society by 2026 would rise to about $26 billion, a figure that they haven't updated the figure, but since the pandemic, that has certainly grown significantly. And that 26 billion plus is really social deficits that the nonprofit sector is expected to sort of manage and to deliver on. But of course, within their capacities, I think that's very unrealistic. And I think we're seeing some of the results of that now when we're looking at food banks and homelessness and so on and so forth. Now, neoliberalism seeks to uphold a restrictive form of resilience that squeezes the nonprofit sector to do ever more with less in the support of even more precarious communities. And by contrast, social resilience opens up pathways for transformative possibilities, challenging the dominance of neoliberal policy and with the promise of building back better Hence, the advocacy voice role of nonprofits are very much brought to the fore in this type of situation. Next slide, please. So what about advocacy then and the settlement sector? Now, broadly speaking, advocacy is the act of voicing the concerns and needs of a constituency and conveying their opinion and representing their interest to the state and to not just the state, but also to others within society and to society at large. It's about promoting and defending and giving voice, in this case, into the interests of migrants, to your clients. Nonprofit organizations like immigrant settlement agencies have two key roles, as I said in the past. That is of service and that of advocacy. And in fact, those roles really do go together. Also, as mission-based organizations, nonprofits are focused on working collaboratively for mutual societal benefit. It must be emphasized that advocacy is also good service. To properly provide for the needs of clients and communities, we need to hear the voices of those who are served so we can understand what those needs are so that communities can also articulate their own interests. And I'll say a few more words about that a little bit later too. The problem is, of course, that the advocacy role is rarely funded. Sometimes you might have foundations that put a bit of money into this, but generally, certainly government is not, these days, not funding it. Actually, there was a time in the past, in the 1970s, where government actually did fund some advocacy to provide some voice for those who were voiced within society. But certainly under neoliberal thinking, this was completely cut out. So advocacy is generally done out of the side of the desk, if you will, by most organizations, which means, of course, there's not a lot of extra money. There's not a lot of organizational capacity for most organizations to devote a lot of time to this, given the funding situation of organizations. And yet, as I said, I think it is quite critical. Next slide, please. Now, I think there's different types of advocacy as well. They come in different forms, and I think this is important to note. And there's also different players dealing with advocacy. ISAs and other nonprofit migrant service providers are one group of actors within this. The LIPs, the local immigrant partnerships, are also involved in various ways in advocacy. And umbrella organizations like the Alberta Association of Immigrant Serving Agencies are also have important roles in terms of advocacy. So there's different players, and they play somewhat different roles, I would say, in terms of advocacy. Secondly, advocacy comes in different forms. Hard advocacy to soft advocacy. So some advocacy may be harder, some may be much softer. And hard advocacy, it generally involves direct lobbying of government, engaging in more overt public criticism of policies, and challenging government policy, even in some case protest activities that may be especially engaged in by some of the smaller non-government funded migrant organizations within society. Soft advocacy, by contrast, is about engaging with funders and policymakers, but mostly behind the scenes through regular communication and consultation, by informing and educating officials around client issues and concerns. And the focus on consultation in this approach is about consultation and consensus building quite often. It also, I should say, involves building alliances and understanding outside of the sector through discussions and education, finding common grounds for solidarity. So reaching out and connecting with other organizations, both within the sector, but also outside of the sector. We saw a lot of that actually happening during the pandemic years. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to say a few things about rules and regulations about nonprofits and charitable activity. So, nonprofit status, if a group is registered as a nonprofit, it's a category under the Income Tax Act that provides income tax exemption, but not the ability to issue tax receipts for donors. And these kinds of nonprofit organizations actually face relatively few restrictions in their activities, and including their advocacy kinds of activities. They're given a pretty free range to engage in political forms of activity. Where it's a little bit more tricky is with registered charities. In contrast, they do face more legal and administrative limits on their advocacy activities. Most importantly, in the case of registered charities, partisan activities, that is, the direct or indirect support of a candidate or a party, is prohibited. Um, and these rules were really have come to be modernized and liberalized in the last number of years. Um, so in 2018, the rules around charities and advocacy were greatly relaxed, and they virtually put no limits on nonpartisan advocacy within the missions of organizations. Before that, there was this kind of 10% rule that you could only spend on advocacy. Now, many are not very aware of these changes and that they actually have more scope for movement here. Um, and in fact, most of the advocacy that seems to be engaged in by the sector is, I would call, mostly passive kind of in nature. They're definitely the softer forms of advocacy. And there's a lot of leftover fear about the negative repercussions on stronger forms of advocacy that especially came out of the Harper years. During the Harper period of time, they really used the revenue agency to go after a lot of nonprofits that they thought were engaging in advocacy issues that were hostile to the government, and some lost charitable status, or at least they were audited and so forth, and it really did put the fear into a lot of organizations. So even with the relaxing of rules, there is still this kind of legacy, this leftover legacy of resistance or hesitancy around advocacy. Next slide, please. One problem has been the impact of neoliberalism, austerity, and new public management has worked to very much marketize the nonprofit sector, the nonprofit work, an attempt to make agencies purely service providers under contract, and therefore delegitimizing the advocacy role of nonprofits, diminishing competition within the let me try that again. Diminishing cooperation within the sector in favor of competition, because people are competing for contracts, right? So at the one hand, they say, oh, you need to cooperate. On the other hand, they have systems where organizations are in competition with one another, and that, it makes it more difficult to have meaningful cooperation. They're very market-centered kinds of views. I've already mentioned about Harper here, so I won't say more about that. And with government contracts, there's also very much a built-in motivation reinforced by the funder for the nonprofit contract recipient not to bite the hand that feeds them. And so in this way, neoliberalism has progressively diminished the capacity of nonprofits to fulfill their mission related to their advocacy role within society. Next slide, please. Now, advocacy and neoliberalism. Additionally, government funding contracts can explicitly include what are called muzzling clauses that greatly restrain nonprofit organizations' actions that can be perceived as critical of the funder. So sometimes within those contracts, there's some real kinds of limitations. In this context, advocacy hasn't disappeared, but it's been turned to into what we might think of as liquid advocacy, where nonprofits must be flexible in how they engage in advocacy, with it becoming more intermittent, more hybrid, and masked in its forms to escape the displeasure of government funders. And through that process, contradictory tendencies are set in motion by neoliberalism. And that problem, essentially, of advocacy chill really kind of sets in. On the one hand, organizations are incentivized to refrain, to downplay advocacy. On the other hand, because the populations they serve are more marginalized, it compels some organizations to become more active in advocacy. But this tension results in a fragmented response among nonprofits, and coordinated planning and strategizing among nonprofits become increasingly more and more difficult. Next, please, slide. Advocacy in the nonprofit sector is about relationships and engagement between the state and nonprofits, and inevitably this involves both collaboration and conflict. The effectiveness of softer forms of advocacy rests on the willingness of government officials, of funders, to listen, to engage as true co-producers in services, and respect the voices and perspectives of agencies and even act upon them on a regular basis. Of course, neoliberalism engages nonprofits, but they engage them as contracted alternative service delivery agents, not as true partners with voice. So, obviously that makes advocacy much more challenging. Next, please. Neoliberalism's willingness to listen on policy has been extremely limited. Although around more pragmatic programming issues, there is an openness. So if they see a problem with programming that's reported by an organization, they will listen to those kinds of things. But on the more policy kinds of fronts, they tend to be much more closed-eared, if you will. Given this history, it's not surprising that advocacy remains an issue of some sensitivity, not just some, great sensitivity, I would say, in the settlement sector, and differing approaches to it exist. Some don't even like to speak about advocacy at all. They'll speak in terms of community engagement. Others, they'll also speak about cooperation, but they really move away from the idea of advocacy. Others are more comfortable in sort of speaking about advocacy. Next slide, please. Now, let me just turn and say a few things about the pandemic. The key development during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada was that the IRCC relationship with immigrant settlement agencies and the broader settlement sector shifted with the move away from new public management approaches to one of truer partnerships based on listening, regular communication, more respectful relationships, rule relaxation to enhance flexibility, collaboration, and strong government support of the sector during the pandemic. This is the context in which soft advocacy actually is very effective at building collaboration and cooperative partnerships where voice is heard and acted upon. The pandemic really did open up a policy window, creating space for alternative visions of policy, including for the immigrant settlement sector. The dominance of neoliberal approaches was challenged, and the prospect of building back better along more inclusive lines became a possibility. The pandemic was a great revealer and a reshaper of relationships. It was a time of building connections and allies for common cause. So it showed some, I think, really positive ways forward. And, these are things that we should learn from the pandemic and build upon. I'm not sure that's the direction we're going, but that's, the lessons that should actually come out of this. Next slide, please. During the pandemic, there was an emphasis on meeting the crisis through collaboration and partnerships within and between sectors. Uh, Immigrant settlement agencies developed enhanced relationships with bodies such as food banks, health centers, schools, and others in the spirit of collaboration, sharing, and the use of voice. Collaboration and partnerships were greatly expanded during this time, and LIPS did play an especially important role here, this kind of coordinating role. And the prioritization on collaboration during the pandemic stood in contrast to funder practices during normal neoliberal times that is centered on competition among agencies. So that competition really was certainly muted during that period, and cooperation was really put to the fore. Next slide, please. I did want to also say a few things about the need to empower clients and community. As part of the settlement sector advocacy about settlement sector advocacy is the need not just to advocate for immigrant communities, but promote self-advocacy by clients and cause advocacy directed at policy change, elements that can result in transformative shifts. In this process, immigrants and their communities are empowered and enabled with the capacity to amplify their own voices and exercise influence over their own destinies. Next slide. For nonprofit organizations, consequently, their advocacy role is not only to speak on behalf of their clients, but to aid in the empowerment of immigrants as citizens with collective voice. This is key to achieving social justice and to building back better, I believe. As community leaders in the settlement sector have expressed, it's not enough to directly advocate with government bodies, but we must reach further into society. We've got to have a public dialogue. Governments won't always listen. You've got to sort of change public opinion. You've got to, be connected to your community and be able to advocate within that community and show the value of what you're doing and the vulnerability of the clients that are being served and why changes within policy are necessary. And I think this is part of the role that nonprofits can play in supporting and enhancing democracy.
Your bed for a little while. Come on.
Next slide, please. I'm almost done. So I want to say a few words by way of conclusion and talk a bit in that about resilience and nonprofit advocacy today. Whoops, did I miss a page? Sorry. Oh, okay, let me just do this from here. So going forward, there's a great danger that neoliberalism's hyper-competitive funding model within the settlement sector will once again dominate with the closing down of advocacy, voice, and the collaborative spirit, the closing down of that. Under conditions of hybrid service delivery, this will greatly intensify competition between agencies, overcoming past geographical barriers. This is particularly a harmful situation for small and medium-sized organizations. In this case, the lessons of the pandemic will not have been learned, that there'll be a return to past practice, and we're, I think, already seeing a lot of evidence of that, and more one-sided competitive funding relationships where voice is muted again. So that progressive policy window will have been fully shut. Next slide, please. And here, in terms of conclusion, neoliberal governments engage with nonprofits, but as contracted alternative service delivery agents, not as true partners, as I said with voice before. It's a form of what has been called antagonistic collaboration. I do kind of like that term because it's really quite contradictory. It's a situation perpetuating precarity and subordination of the sector to the neoliberal state. It is the social justice missions, I believe, including the voice-oriented components of this mission, that drive nonprofit organizations to be innovative and socially resilient, to contest precarity and to stand up for the community interests in a more equitable society. The post-pandemic period has become what the BC Nonprofit Sector Report in 2024 has described as less resilient times, as many nonprofit service providers are facing rapidly increasing demands and weakened capacity. And the Ontario Nonprofit Network report, called Building on Hope, Nonprofit Sector Seeking Stability, surveyed the member responses to this for this report, and they saw a real duality here between the idea of hope and despair. So 45% of the respondents reported feeling overwhelmed and a little out of control, and 41% felt a degree of optimism at the moment that they could work through things. But obviously, a lot of anxiety within that. And it does, I think, reveal the duality and tension between precarity and resilience that we've talked about. But capacity, I think, remains a burning issue, along with the limited resources that organizations in that context have to do resilience. Final speaking slide. Political developments on several fronts, and I'm thinking here about regionally, nationally, and internationally, suggest we've entered a period of reinforced neoliberalism and kind of rightward drift. And this includes, unfortunately, a growing anti-immigrant sentiment even within Canada. It's not nearly the same as it is in other places, which is positive, but more of that is kind of creeping, unfortunately, in. And certainly the idea of immigrant numbers, it's reflected quite strongly in terms of a strong support for reduced numbers. Nonprofit advocacy, that voice role, becomes ever more important in the context of growing societal precarity and some of these threats in terms of political direction. So what this means going forward is a matter of urgent reflection and discussion. And I think that's where the discussion period comes in. Next, you can put the next slide on. I just have two slides. So I imagine the slides will be shared, which just cite some of the sources I used throughout. And on that, I just wanted to thank everybody, and happy to engage in some discussion now. Hopefully that didn't go too long.
That was perfect timing. And that was such a wonderful jam-packed presentation, John. Thank you so much. I see one question. And well-paced. I see one question coming in from Iman. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you, John. Thank you, Lindsay, as well. I mean, this was really informative. It's kind of things you feel, you experience working in the sector, but it's something great to see out and hear out loud. It kind of makes you feel like that there is someone listening and someone who knows that this is happening, and it's kind of really important, I think. I have a few questions. Maybe I'll just start with something when you were talking about precarity, specifically, and the fact that this sector serves people who are in precarious situations. But not only that, it also employs a lot of people of color and racialized folks. And so here, and that, I don't think that is an unknown. And certainly, so I guess my question is, this sector is notoriously underpaid, overworked, and stretched. Is this some kind of, deliberate systemic issue that touches people of color in various ways when they work in the sector? I mean, to me, it feels like a systemic issue because it impacts so many people of color in the sector, who work in the sector and serve the sector. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And then I have another question, which is around, I was really interested in this whole difference between nonprofit and charity, which I did not know. So thank you for that, around their ability to advocate. So what if you're both? What if you're both a charity and a nonprofit? How, like, do you kind of have to, let me say, is your nonprofit, yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but what if you're an organization that is both of those things?
Yeah, many are.
Yeah.
Let me go to the second question first. And yeah, very often if a organization is a charity, they're often have probably with the province status as a nonprofit organization. And of course, you have to pay attention to the rules around charity. But the rules have been greatly liberalized, as I said. The real restriction is no partisan activity. So, you can't target a party, you can't support a party. It's, you can talk about policy as long as in a nonprofit way, as long as it's also within the mandate of the organization. However, a lot of service providing organizations that are dependent upon government funding are still quite resistant to doing that, understandably, because they feel that even if there's not restrictions here, that government will look unfavorably on that, and that it'll influence the funding decisions. Whether that happens in practice or not is an open question, because these are not transparent decisions that are made. And some governments may be more inclined to look at this negatively than other governments as well. So oftentimes what happens, like within the settlement sector, is they let the umbrella organizations do the harder forms of advocacy. But they'll, and I think, and very importantly, engage in the softer forms of advocacy, because government doesn't know what's really going on the ground. It's the agencies that know, because they're in contact with the clients all the time, with the communities all the time. So government will often need that kind of feedback. And, I think using that. Sometimes agencies are also engaged. Like the project I was involved with was university government, university community research project. And so they're engaged in producing reports on the sector and on clients and so forth. And they try to use that to inform government and the wider sort of opinion on issues, to show and demonstrate what the problems are. Again, organizations are often very limited because of their capacity. They're doing that research also out of the side of their desk quite often. So they're quite limited in that way. So paying attention to the rules for charities is extremely important, because obviously you don't want to lose your charitable status. But there is a lot more leeway today. But whether the political environment creates restraints is another question, right? But again, a way around that is through other organizations that may not be taking government money, and through umbrella organizations, which again can be a little bit compromised themselves, because they often take government money too for various things. So their voice is not muted, but it may be in some cases they may feel a little bit of the pressures around that as well. In terms of precarity, yeah, one of the things I did mention is that the workforces are precarious because they are under this alternative service delivery model. So in that sense, it is deliberate. This is meant to be cheaper forms of service than government could provide, because it's going to be through these contracts that are going to make sure that people are not going to be compensated at the same level as a government, certainly a government worker. They're likely not to have the benefits. We know that the sector gets a lot of its workforce from the immigrant community. Maybe a lot of those people started as volunteers, and they became, they were later on hired. So in this sense, it is a systemic issue because it's kind of built into the funding model that they're going to be underfunded, and this is a sector that's highly pulls from the immigrant and racialized communities. So it's an issue, and of course, and we know there's a lot of HR issues within the sector now because they're finding it hard in a tighter labor market. It's easing up now, unemployment rising a little bit, but they're finding it harder to retain staff, and especially staff who've got particular kinds of skills. So it's an issue around compensation and under compensation for groups of people, but also to the sustainability of the organizations and sector itself.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. We had two other questions pop up here, John. The first one is from Jeff. His question is, with most not-for-profits, private sector heavy boards of directors, especially in Calgary, oil and gas heavy, who are often very focused on social enterprise and other market-based solutions as a response to not-for-profit precarity. How do we push for, or do you have any examples of organizations that have been successful in promoting advocacy and collaboration?
Thanks, Jeff, for putting me on the spot in that one. Yeah, I mean, the boards of directors of organizations, boards of management, is a bit of an issue in terms of are they representative of the communities that they're serving? And oftentimes, in some respects, they're not, because they do pull heavily, quite often, from the corporate sector. In part, that's because they need to fill positions like treasurer, maybe somebody in communications and so forth. And they're also looking oftentimes to build connections into the business communities who may hire immigrants, right? I was on the board of a nonprofit and chair of the board for a while, actually, of a largish nonprofit employment agency that specialized mostly in immigrants, and there was a heavy draw upon people from the business community within that. And there was a lot of, I think one of the big things there was also educating the boards to understand that this is not a business. This is a nonprofit, and that there's different goals and how to reach into the community. And that's can be a real struggle. I would say a particular organization is not coming right to mind at the moment, but I think the agencies within the sector should be commended for their ability to do a lot of juggling, and I think they do try to speak for their clients often in these softer ways, and I think that's where the umbrella organizations come in, because they're the ones who can have a bigger voice and not have the same sort of threat to them. But I think, and I think a lot of the smaller organizations within society, they may not be that stable in terms of funding. These are the ones that don't draw upon government support. and sometimes they might seem a little bit out there. But I think they're really important in terms of raising a lot of the issues and making government pay at least a little bit of attention and getting some media press that pushes these issues to the front. Because, you know, once the media gets on to particular issues and begins to educate the public, you know, government is more likely to pay more attention to it. You know, I think, you know, within the sector, you need to support your umbrella organizations. You need to engage in more cooperative activity to try to approach the funders in a more cooperative way. But again, it's difficult under the kind of funding model because it does tend to pit organizations, certainly in terms of the funding, against one another. And with now that you've got organizations that can actually deliver a lot of the services at a distance because of the changes during the pandemic to moving online, that could, my fear is that that could really open up even greater competition for governments who are saying, well, let's get some of the bigger organizations to do a lot more of this delivery, right? And, you know, the organizations, and, you know, there are lots of good things to say about distant delivery. Because, you know, for rural communities, for hard to reach populations, these can be real advantages, and all organizations are going to be using those. But it could also be used to intensify the competition within the sector. And I think that could be very detrimental to especially some of the smaller organizations. Because nonprofits, you need to have a presence within the community. It, you know, can't just be a distance kind of relationship. So we need to take advantage of what learnings from the pandemic in terms of delivery without feeling that this can all just be done remotely and by some large, better resourced organization.
There was another question there, but from Lori. Lori, I'm not sure if you still wanted to ask that. No pressure. If not, just not in my chat anymore. So if you wanted to plop it back in, I can read it for you. If you want to raise your hand, feel free to do that as well. Maybe in the meantime, John, I have one of my, oh, sure. Lori's here. Perfect. Oh. Lori, go ahead.
Sorry, it was so poorly written that I removed it. One of the concerns that I've gotten, it's just the multiple layers of issues in regards to both local, provincial, and federal government jurisdictions. So that often what happens is you get bounced around, or there's, so, you know, explicitly around working with Ukrainian evacuees, it became very complicated. Because everybody was trying to say it was somebody else's, and so it made it so that you were in the middle and couldn't really advocate in any way. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on how we begin to break that kind of a dynamic down, particularly here in Alberta.
Well, I'm not sure about particularly Alberta, but I think this has been a long standing problem across the country, is you've got multiple funders, and they're not always necessarily communicating very well with each other. I think, you know, some of the communication, I'm not sure about the Ukrainians in this instance. And there was a lot of learning from the Syrian situation, right? Where organizations and people who were funders were cooperating, but then that seemed to be forgotten. And then, you know, with the Afghans, it was kind of really forgotten, right? And then with the Ukrainians, of course, a lot of rules were bent, right? Because for settlement funding, they were, even though they're temporary, they were given full access to all of those types of services and so forth. So it was a little bit of a different sort of situation. But you know, part of the other problem is that you've got a lot of movement within government, so that within departments at federal, provincial levels, you've got people moving out, and then they don't have all the background information, so they're reinventing the wheel all the time. And that's also a problem in terms of advocacy. You build a you need to build relationships, right, with people. And it's very hard when you've got a system with government where people are, for promotion purposes and so forth, are on the move on a continuous basis. You're continually rebuilding those kinds of networks and relationships. And even I think within the sector now, there's a lot more movement with a lot of retirement of the leadership that took place immediately after the pandemic years. So I'm not sure what the solution to that is. I think it is to try to continuously hammer home the point that this doesn't make any sense, that we need more. We need to listen to the voices of the multiple funders and the people delivering the services and the clients to be able to get these things right. We shouldn't be completely reinventing the wheel every time a new stream of refugees comes in terms of what is to be done. I mean, the lessons from that should be noted down, and the mistakes and the things that worked should be documented and should be discussed and followed by the different groups. And that's why I think in part the research end of it is also important, to learn what is working and how that collaboration can work. But it's government is not always the most transparent vehicle in which a lot of that sort of happens. And so I think it's something we have to keep pounding away at, but I don't think it has a quick, easy solution to. Sorry for that very unsatisfactory answer, Lori.
Wonderful. Okay. If anyone has any other questions, you can always reach out to John.
Absolutely.
I plugged your email address into the chat there. And maybe this is a good time to go ahead and do our book raffle, if that works for everybody. So I have taken a list of everyone who is attending.
I won't put my name in.
I took our names out, John.
Yeah,
so don't worry. But I'm gonna go ahead and just share my screen here, and we can go ahead and spin.
Oh, fancy.
Yes, very fancy, yes. Okay, and we have Shanice. Shanice is our winner. Awesome. So Shanice, we will be reaching out soon, me and Jessica, to coordinate that. Yeah, and I see we have a lot of comments coming in the chat of thank yous. Yeah, thank you so much, John. Thank you for your time. This has been super informative and very interesting.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. I'm happy they reached out and was happy to participate. Great. I think the hub is a really great idea. Hopefully it expands beyond, and I know there's other people from beyond Alberta using it, and it should really be, I think it is a new best practice.
Yeah, we hope so too. And I mean, you brought it up with, COVID bringing all these new windows and opportunities, but that is one of the great things of being able to do our lunch and learns online, is we can spread them across. So thank you everyone for carving out time and being here today, and we hope to see you January 30th next year, and happiest of holidays to all of you. Take good care.
Bye. Great. Thank you.
Awesome, John. So I'll send you an email just to with a little bit of follow-up. And yeah, again, thanks so much.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.